Hello, warriors. It is Wednesday, March 18th, or at least it should be when you're watching this. If you're watching this a little bit later, then hurry up, guys, get your work done. And I'm hoping that you're having a good week so far. I know things are extraordinarily strange, but do remember you can always reach out to me, especially during office hours from 10:30 until noon every day over YouTube live stream. Jump in if you have a question. I'd be glad to answer it. Otherwise, let's get moving here. So you should have your guided notes in front of you or paper and pen and get ready to take some notes. Um, excuse me. Um, so what we're going to be talking about today is what we call sometimes the late or the high Middle Ages, meaning essentially the period from about 1000 to today we're going to go to about 1250 CE. Sometimes you can include up to about 1450 if you really want to stretch it. But for me, I think 1450 gets into the Renaissance, which is next unit. So today our focus is going to be largely on the Crusades, the expansion of economic activity in the High Middle Ages. And unfortunately, I do have one last thing I need to talk about today. It's part of the standards. It's a bit weird to talk about right now, and that's the Black Death. We have to talk about the bubonic plague. So I don't want to kind of like make you super freaked out about it, but it is something that I have to talk about according to standards. So we're going to talk about it. I'll try to be as straightforward as I can about it and hopefully not scare you. So here we go. So what I want to talk about today is I'm going to start with the Crusades. So we left off yesterday discussing the role of the Roman Catholic Church in Western Europe. And I mentioned that it really was sort of this stabilizing force, especially after the fall of the Roman Empire. It provided a huge amount of social services, economic services, spiritual, educational, and even health benefits to people during extraordinary times. The church reached out to the poor. It provided education for people in terms of literacy. And so the church was a very powerful entity. And that is relevant to the Crusades because if you remember all the way back to Unit 3, when we talked about the Byzantine Empire and the rise of the Islamic caliphates, I mentioned the fact that the caliphates in the Byzantine Empire were always fighting. They were primarily fighting over territory, but over time, that fighting also became religiously driven, particularly when the Seljuk Turks, a group of nomadic pastoralists from Central Asia, kind of like an early version of the Mongols, came in and took over territory in what is today Israel and Palestine. Now, by the time the Seljuk Turks took over the Holy Land, including Jerusalem, had already been under Muslim control for several centuries. It wasn't a new thing. However, the Seljuk Turks really didn't have a lot of contact with non-Muslim populations, unlike, say, the Umayyad and Abbasid caliphates. Like the Abbasids and the Umayyads were used to living and working with people who weren't Muslim, and in fact, they benefited from those populations. So while they might tax people who were non-Muslims a little bit higher, the Umayyads and the Abbasids didn't really like try to kick them out or anything like that. But the Seljuks, on the other hand, had a different perspective. So the Seljuks attacked into the Byzantine Empire pretty fiercely. And what resulted was that only about 30 years after the Great Schism, remember the split between the Eastern and Western Christian Church, the Byzantine Emperor wrote to the Pope in Rome saying, hey, we need help. I know that we don't like each other. I know that like we do stuff differently with Easter and we believe different things about communion and all of that sort of stuff. But like we're both Christian and these outside groups are attacking into our territory and we could really use some help. The other big cause for the Crusades was the fact that when the Seljuks took over Jerusalem, they actually shut the city down to outside Christian groups coming in on pilgrimage. And that was a problem. So pilgrimage is a religious essentially a religious trip. It is usually marked by prayer along the route, and you usually stop at certain places where holy things have occurred. Lots of different faiths go on pilgrimage. We know that the Muslim population goes on pilgrimage. We already talked about the Hajj, but Christians went on pilgrimage as well, and they especially went to Jerusalem because if you're Christian, Jerusalem is critically important in terms of the theology. But when the Seljuk Turks conquered Jerusalem, they shut down the area to Christian pilgrims. And that was a theological problem, not just a political one, but a theological one. So, as a result, the Pope in Rome decided to call for essentially a war against what he termed the infidel Muslim Turkish population. Those are his words, not mine, by the way. I want to be very clear on that. Infidel is a word that means the unfaithful. So he essentially saw Muslims as being in the incorrect point of view with regards to religion. And so he saw them as a force that needed to be purified and removed from power. This is obviously a problematic statement, but regardless, Pope Urban II called for this, for Christians in Western Europe to rise up, to form armies, and to go and take back the Holy Land. Now, there were other reasons beyond the theological as to why you have the Pope calling for this. First of all, this occurred only about 30 years after the formation of the Great Schism, or rather after the Great Schism, and the creation of two separate branches of Christianity. And so essentially what the Pope is seeing here is that perhaps if he, as a leader of the Roman Catholic faith, can call for an army to rise up and to overthrow the Muslim Seljuk Turks and retake Jerusalem, then it will show sort of like God's favor to Catholic populations, and see maybe that might be a way to spread Roman Catholicism into the Byzantine Empire, into Russia, and into other Christian areas. So there's kind of a political reason why he's doing this too. Plus, the Pope is really annoyed that a lot of kings keep trying to appoint members to high positions within the church. He's really upset that you have, like, say, the King of England trying to appoint the Archbishop of Canterbury. And so as a result, he thinks that if he can call an army to go and retake the Holy Land, it will show that the Pope is more powerful than secular leaders like kings or the Holy Roman Emperor. And to a degree, that was initially proven true. This map right here is a map of the various crusades that occurred. One thing you have to know is that the crusades were not just one thing. They were a series of wars. There's at least 12, depending on how you count them. This map right here doesn't even show all of them. The first one, the first crusade, I'm just going to talk really broadly about it. The first crusade is in red here, and you can see that you had kind of like two wings of armies, one coming from the Germanic regions, another coming from the French, heading over here first to Constantinople because they were going to help out the Byzantine Empire, and then journeying from there into the Holy Land over here. The first crusade was relatively successful from the Catholic point of view. They managed to retake Jerusalem, and all of that shaded in area right here fell under Roman Catholic kingdoms. Essentially the Latin Christian kingdoms is what they were called over here. For a brief period of time, they established their own little governments. Now, the problem is that over time, people in this area who were Muslim regrouped and tried to fight back against these Latin Christian kingdoms that formed. And that spawned the Second Crusade. The Second Crusade is kind of boring, doesn't really matter all that much. It was totally unsuccessful. Nobody really from the Western European area was able to get anything done. The Third Crusade, on the other hand, is kind of fascinating. So the Third Crusade is called the Crusade of Kings, and basically what occurred was King Richard of England and the King of France, Louis, and the the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II decided that they were going to go and try to retake Jerusalem, which had again fallen to a Muslim kingdom in the area. A general by the name of Saladin held the city, and he was a brilliant military strategist. So these three kings decide to raise an army and to march on Jerusalem. And, Frederick II decides to take a bath while he is crossing a river and drowns. His army decides that since their king is dead, they're just going to turn around and go home, which they did. And then King Louis of France was basically like, hey, if the German guy's not going to come, then I'm not going trying to go, and so he just bailed and went back home. And basically that meant that the Third Crusade was just the English. And it was kind of a draw, actually. They managed to hold it off pretty well. But there were a whole bunch of these crusades. The worst of them, from my perspective, is the Children's Crusade, where a monk in Germany had a vision from God that told him that only children could defeat the infidel populations, and so they formed this massive army of like 6,000 kids. Some of them were captured and sold into slavery. It's really terrible stuff. So the Crusades were a disaster. Now, to a degree, there were some benefits in terms of economics, not in terms of military outcomes. First of all, there was increased trade within Europe as a result of the Crusades, because you had more people traveling as they were going to Jerusalem to fight. In particular, a lot of people, before they would go and fight, they would stop off in Italy. And that totally makes sense, because they were going to get blessed by the Pope before they went on this holy war. And so they would go down into Italy, do a lot of business there, and this was therefore very beneficial to Italian city-states, particularly in Venice and Genoa and in Pisa. It was also actually very, very good for individual monarchs. Unlike what the Pope had initially anticipated, the Pope had thought that this would increase his power. But over time, what happened was it increased the ability of individual monarchs to call an army to their benefit. And it resulted in a loss of power for the Pope, and also a decline in the use of feudalism. One thing that we do see, however, that comes out that is really important for us to understand about the Crusades is that it increased tensions between differing religious groups in a really, really negative way. Roman Catholic troops, as they moved from Western Europe into Eastern European territories like the Byzantine Empire, they didn't distinguish between the notion that like Eastern Orthodox Christians were still Christians and therefore were kind of like technically on the same side. They saw Eastern Orthodox Christians as just as blasphemous as other populations. And so they attacked Christian populations. They especially targeted Jewish populations. You saw an extreme rise in anti-Semitism during the Crusades. And you also saw a whole lot of violence and discrimination against Muslim populations, especially in places like Spain. You also saw a weakening of the Byzantine Empire, because those Western European armies, as they moved through, they weren't necessarily doing what the Byzantine Empire initially asked. They weren't fighting on behalf of the Byzantines. They were just fighting anybody who wasn't Catholic. So the Crusades were a sincerely mixed bag in terms of the outcome. I'm going to stop here before I move on to the next couple of topics. There's really not much left to talk about, guys. So if you'll move on to the next video as soon as this stops.